Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here, I do want to remind you yet again that if you do feel so inclined throughout the show, if you want to interact with it more directly, making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube is the best way to do it. You can contribute in many different ways. You can click the $sign, leave a tip or donation, or you can just leave a comment if you want to interact with the show. But anything you leave is greatly appreciated by me, my fellow podcasters, and all our shows, and especially the network as a whole, and it just makes it that much better. But without further ado, let us jump right into our second segment of today's show, talking about some of the fantasy stars of the week here. Now, all of these fantasy stars are players that either really stepped up this week or are proven to be some of the best at their respective positions this season in fantasy terms. Now, some of these guys are first-time appearances on the list, and some of these guys already are stalwarts of this list. It's that time of the season where guys in fantasy just separate themselves from the pack, and you really know who's who. So without further ado, let's jump right into them. Starting off with the quarterback position, this guy is making his first appearance on one of my lists. And I'm glad to see him here. He's been steadily improving week in, week out. The rookie quarterback sensation, going abroad in London, beating quote-unquote London team in the Jacksonville Jaguars, let alone that. So without further ado, Caleb Williams, as we have to go to the end to get to him, is my fantasy QB star of the week. 23 of 29 passing, 226 yards, 4 touchdowns, most importantly, 28.64 fantasy points. This game kind of represented the improvements we've seen from Caleb Williams. At the start of the season, he was a little bit timid, wasn't necessarily making good decisions in the pocket, wasn't necessarily working well outside of structure, wasn't really trusting his offensive line, which had its issues throughout the season. But as we've seen him go on, as we've seen him improve and trust this deep wide receiver core, we've seen magical things out of Caleb that we expected when he was selected first overall. And this game in London, his first ever trip abroad, he played perhaps his best game as a starter in the NFL. Yes, it was against the Jacksonville Jaguars, and I get that. But this is kind of the game that we were all expecting Caleb Williams to have kind of at the start of the season. But even though we've gotten it a couple of weeks after the fact, it's still a performance that we can lay our kind of bets on in saying that Caleb Williams will just show steady improvement week in, week out for this team. And so I'm looking forward to more performances like this from him, looking forward to seeing if he finds his place onto this list more consistently, but he is my fantasy QB star of the week. At the running back position, we saw a little bit, going back here in my graphic, to Derrick Henry, a familiar face here on this list in this segment, coming in as my fantasy running back star of the weekend. And in this game, a game that was perhaps the most exciting of the weekend to many NFL fans, Derrick Henry proved why he is now becoming one of the focal points of the Baltimore Ravens offense. 24 carries, 132 yards, 2 touchdowns, 25.2 fantasy points for Derrick Henry in this game. It's just going to show that, let alone being someone who I personally thought was not going to be a star for the Baltimore Ravens just because of the fact that I like their more committee approach, he has proved every single pundit who distrusted this move wrong. And he's really proven that he has been someone who the Baltimore Ravens can rely upon for long periods of the season whenever they're in trouble. And I really think that going forward, Derrick Henry is someone who I'm excited to see progress in this team, because there will be games in the AFC North and in the playoffs in which Derrick Henry is going to have to be very multifaceted and certainly going to have a lot of questions asked of him. Now, what we've seen from him at the start of the season is otherworldly, but that's where I feel like a lot of doubts will seep in. That's where the caveats will be when we think of Derrick Henry in this offense. But just looking at this game against the Commanders, the toughest opponent to date for them outside of perhaps the Buffalo Bills, in this game, he's proving why the Baltimore Ravens trusted him out of any other running back on their team. Being free to let go of Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins and acquire Derrick Henry is justifying every step of the way. So I'm looking forward to seeing more out of him in this Baltimore Ravens offense because it's becoming one of the best offenses in the league yet again, much like last season. So the sky's the limit for how many appearances my man Derrick Henry will make on this list. But coming in as my fantasy wide receiver of this week, this is a guy who last year a lot of fantasy football managers may have been a little bit disappointed by or let down by. He is someone, though, who at the end of the day is still a very valuable wide receiver 2, wide receiver 1 hybrid sometimes, but can get the job done any given week for you, and that is my man Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We always knew that Chris Godwin was always a vital piece of this Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense, but the question was, can he become more consistent in the level of performances he has across a 17-game season? And thus far, he has outshined my wildest expectations for him. 11 receptions, 125 yards, 2 touchdowns in this game against the New Orleans Saints, picking up a much-needed NFC South victory for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 35.5 fantasy points for him as well, so not too shabby. But just seeing the contrast from Chris Godwin kind of at the start of the season last year, throughout the season, into this season, just seeing the progress he's made as the wide receiver 2 in Tampa, just seeing how he's become so multifaceted, become so integral to the makeup of this Bucs offense, being that kind of intelligent, high IQ wide receiver the Bucs can always rely upon when things go awry. I've really grown to appreciate him from last season, because last season he was on my fantasy team and didn't really put together many consistent performances for me. But over the past couple of weeks, he's had consistent performances for the Bucs, supplementing Mike Evans so well at the wide receiver position that I'm really excited to see through a whole season if he can maintain that certain level that we've seen out of him. Because if he can, he's certainly the most exciting wide receiver 2 option you can find on the fantasy market if you are looking for that kind of guy. But this game and other games in the NFC South for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers will go to prove why Chris Godwin is just a tier above some of those guys in that division. He's the difference maker, whereas other teams can't necessarily seem to find a wide receiver 2 as consistent as a guy like Chris Godwin in that division. So that's why he's such an important fantasy player as well, because in divisional games, he's more of a difference maker than any other wide receiver in the NFC South, because he's such a consistent wide receiver 2. And that's why he's my fantasy wide receiver star of the week, for his performances in those divisional games. Hopefully we get to see more out of him in these divisional games throughout the year. My last player that I want to go over is one of my fantasy stars of the weekend. It's a tight end, actually. A guy who actually contributed to this game in so many different ways, not just as a tight end, but as a long snapper as well. Multi-faceted player, kind of a guy going under the radar on my personal fantasy football team that I want to shout out. How about Mr. Cole Kmet? I apologize for this graphic. It should say the Chicago Bears, not the Penn State Indian Lions. That should foreshadow my college football fantasy stars of the weekend, if you will. But talking about Cole Kmet, 5 receptions, 70 yards, 2 touchdowns. Just a guy who sneakily could emerge in the top 10 of tight ends in fantasy when it's all said and done at the end of the season. He's someone who might not get the big yardage totals like the Kelceys and Kittles of the world, or the touchdown totals like the Fergusons and perhaps Schultzes of the world. But he is someone who warrants a look at because in the red zone is where he's most potent. He's certainly not going to get the most targets out of anyone in this team, but he certainly is someone who is going to get meaningful targets as a tight end for the Chicago Bears. Because, yes, you look at the wide receiver room and you see a lot of depth there, and you don't necessarily see the potential for a guy like Cole Kmet to get many receptions or many targets as well. But when he does, it translates into effective fantasy output for you. He's not someone who you kind of have to go week in, week out and kind of orient his matchups as you see fit. He's someone who, yes, you're not reliant on as much as top tier tight ends, but at the end of the day, he gets you the job done. And not for nothing, even in such a volatile market, he's someone who's kind of the constant in this kind of weird tier of guys trying to separate themselves from tiers 3 and 4. I think he's kind of in the middle tier there, but this performance goes to show that he can still have effective performances for you in real life and fantasy, if you so choose. But that should just about do it for this segment. Let me know what you think in the comments, who your fantasy stars of the weekend might have been. These are just mine. I might want to hear your opinions as well. You are welcome to leave them. But coming up on the other side, we transition from the NFL to college football for just a little bit, as we are going to talk about my college football fantasy stars of the weekend. Like I said, I foreshadowed. Sorry about that graphic change there, mishap there, because the Penn State Nittany Lions are not an NFL team, but there's a player from the Penn State Nittany Lions that I want to mention in my next segment. We'll be right back to talk about that, so don't go anywhere, because we'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without